I think this is going to be an exciting panel. I'm Lindsay Hoffman. I'm an associate professor of communication here at the University of Delaware. I also am the director of our National Agenda Speaker Series and associate director of the Center for Political Communication. We have a great panel that has changed slightly over the course of the day. Tricia obviously went before, and because Britton's not here, Emma is filling in. So I'll give a brief background on our speakers, and then I'll let them take over. So Brandi Collins-Dexter serves as the Media Justice Director for colorofchange.org, the country's largest online civil rights group. She comes to Color of Change from the Center for Media Justice, an organization fighting for media rights, access, representation for marginalized communities. Carmen Scott is the Senior Policy Counsel for Free Press. She works to protect the open internet, prevent media and telecom industry concentration, promote affordable internet access, and foster media diversity. And lastly, we have Emma, Llanso, who spoke earlier. She's at the Center for Democracy and Technology, the director of the Free Expression Project, which works to promote law and policy that supports users' free expression rights in the United States and around the world. So this last session is all about non-legal responses to hate speech on digital platforms. I'll go ahead and hand it over to our panelists, and hopefully we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A towards the end. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brandi Collins-Dexter. Thank you for sticking through the day. I know there was a lot of really interesting conversation in that last panel. As I was preparing for today, I found myself going through all the speeches that I've had to do in the last few years in the aftermath of a tragedy. I found a speech that I gave on the steps of the state capitol in South Carolina. I was there to deliver petitions calling for them to remove the Confederate flag from the state grounds. I was there because a man just a week earlier had used that flag as a justification for walking into Emmanuel African American Methodist Church and murdering 9 people. I remember I was shaking so hard on those steps as I told the story of my great-grandfather, a sharecropper from Clarksdale, Mississippi, who disappeared after getting into a disagreement with his employer who refused to pay him for his work, an employer who we later found out via a local newspaper was also a known Klansman. I said then that the same Confederate flag that flew over my grandmother's head when she was forced to leave town at the age of 9 was the same one waved around by a psychopath whose manifesto continues to fester online. I remember looking out at that moment and seeing neo-Nazis holding up that same flag and watching me with hatred in their eyes as I told that story. It was one of the few times in my life that I genuinely feared for my life. I did know then that it wouldn't be the last time. I feel like in some ways I've almost become desensitized to the number of threats I or my organization has received, in part because I know they're a drop in the bucket compared to what so many people on the front lines of doing this work have to face every day. While I don't want to speak the name of the Emmanuel 9 killer in this space, his family told the public what would become an increasingly familiar story. The story of someone pushed to extremes by overexposure to violent ideologies online. This was something I would put to the test myself when I started using a device that was explicitly for my research on white nationalist communities. I found that when the computer began to read my data profile as a conservative white male, it fundamentally changed my user experience. Hey, you follow Mike Cernovich, Twitter would ask, but have you tried following David Duke or David Horowitz? Amazon would see that I was looking up a book about Laura Southern and would make sure I could also buy Mein Kampf and a plethora of neo-Nazi paraphernalia that I could get shipped to me by the next day. I would be bombarded with articles on Yahoo and other places talking about the dangerous blacks in Chicago killing each other. Eventually, it would become content about the Clintons and their plot to destroy America. I found that my world was profoundly shaped by who the internet thought I was, and once I was relegated to that bubble, there seemed to be no way to get out, at least not on that computer. As we began to go deeper and deeper into the work, we began to realize at Color of Change that many of our colleagues were also ringing the alarm in the US and around the world around what we were seeing online. Research by groups like SPLC and Data and Society showed both an alarming rise in hate groups and the means by which they built power online for decades. We connected with experts from around the world seeking a deeper understanding of how we move out of the stance of waiting for the next tragedy and how we could put forth solutions to slow down, if not stop, the next tragedy. We researched a lot of the groups that we were fighting against, and many of these groups had less obvious names than Ku Klux Klan, and were actively organizing online, often through gateway content that increasingly pushed people towards more violent ideologies. By having loose and often unenforced policies on various platforms, these groups were able to exploit loopholes and have a veneer of legitimacy that allowed them to operate increasingly unchecked. They were able to push video and audio content on YouTube, sell paraphernalia and self-published books on Amazon, sell tickets to their events on Eventbrite, harass and seek to intimidate thought leaders, many disproportionately people of color and women, on places like Twitter, and organize violent encounters on Facebook. And so we saw all of this, and as we learned more and more, we began to realize that we needed to draw a line in the sand for corporations, explicitly those who hold the most power in being able to rein in terrorism and deprive it of the digital oxygen it needed to thrive online. We had to make them choose, and it was important for them to understand by staying neutral in these times, they were in fact making a choice. I found another speech that I gave. This time, it was right after 11 people were massacred in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh late last year. Incidentally, that was the same week we released these principles. In the speech I gave at that time, I said that I couldn't imagine any word or phrase that I would find online that I thought I would choose to protect over a human life. And I still feel that way. Today I give this speech after waking up to the news that 49 people were gunned down in New Zealand in the Muslim community of Christchurch. At this very moment, the live stream video of their murders remains up on platforms like Reddit. I feel like we have to do our due diligence, and we have to hold corporations accountable to making sure that everybody can feel safe in their churches, temples, mosques, and synagogues. They should feel safe in their schools. They should feel safe online. We in the Change the Terms Coalition were tired of being told that there was nothing that could be done by tech companies to protect our communities. We were tired of being decentered from discussions around how best to deal with hate content online. And it was so strikingly clear that current policies and enforcement mechanisms by big tech companies were not built with marginalized communities in mind, even though we over-index on those platforms and they need our business to exist. Change the Terms is comprised of, I believe at this point, 50 or maybe more than 50 civil and human rights organizations that believe tech companies need to do more to ensure that they are doing their part to help combat hate and conduct on their platforms. Their platforms must not be a place for extremists to grow their influence and spread their hateful ideas. Our organizations track the progress of major tech companies, especially social media platforms, and push them to adopt and implement model corporate policies, which Carmen will talk a little more in depth about. We're meeting with those companies, and we're not just rejecting ideas, but putting forth real concrete solutions that we see as the way forward. So with that, I will close and pass to Carmen to say more about the actual details of that, and thanks for having me.
I need to lower it. Okay, that's fine. Oh, okay, that's better. Thank you, everyone. So I'm Carmen Scurato. I'm with Free Press. And I'm just gonna, how do I, just the arrows. Nope. There we go. All right. So I want to talk a little bit more detail about Change the Terms. And this is recommended corporate policies for internet companies to reduce hateful activities on their services. So Change the Terms is really the shorthand, and you can read more about it on changetheterms.org. And I think this is great that we're actually the last panel, because it touches on some of the questions that were raised at the very beginning and kind of throughout the day, and some statements that have been made. So I took some notes, and I'm just going to throw these questions out there so we can see how these Change the Terms corporate policies answer those questions. So one of the ones very early this morning was, who do you trust more to regulate speech, the government or the tech bros in Silicon Valley? Another question that we had, or another question was, how can the historically disadvantaged use free speech to gain better equality? And some statements that we had is that hate speech isn't new, but the mechanisms of online speech are new, and where algorithms privilege extreme or violent content. And actually, Emma raised this on her panel, that one of the things that we're grappling with is scale, just the sheer amount of content that is being placed on these platforms every hour. And over lunch, we saw that tech platforms are actually being optimized for abuse. And some of the questions raised there were, whose job is it to understand the historical context? And whose job is it to anticipate those unintended consequences? So, and something that Brandy just said, something that we realized as we were doing all this research is that these platforms were not built with marginalized communities in mind. So what does it look like when you center marginalized communities and then try to find solutions? And that's where we got to change the terms. So one of the first things that we tried to do is define hateful activities. And I'm going to go through this definition because we found this very important, and it's very central to the mission of Change the Terms, which is activities that incite or engage in violence, intimidation, harassment, threats, or defamation targeting an individual or group based on their actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, immigration status, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. And part of the reason we came to this definition is that these online platforms, they are not beholden to the First Amendment. But if they were, these things were also things that were actually illegal under the First Amendment. So violence, intimidation, harassment, threats, defamation, and that's why we came to this definition. So we did think about it because we do believe in free speech principles as well. So the other thing that we wanted to define is internet companies. We talked a lot about Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, but these policies go beyond that because what we wanted to tackle was also this the cycle that happens where you actually fund hate. And hate is very profitable online. So how do you just tackle that? Like, how do you, as Brandy said, like, how do you take away the digital oxygen, and how do you take away the money incentive to spread hate online? So that's why internet companies is defined more broadly, again, than just the platforms that we were talking about today. So it's also companies that sell advertising online, facilitate financial transactions, provide public chat services, provide domain names, and build or host websites. So it is a very broad definition of internet companies. And so here is the policy overviews. And I'm going to go through each of them. Some of the slides, as you'll see moving forward, are a little dense, but I'll go through them. And this will be something that we'll make available. And also, you'll have a full document, if you'd like to read it, on changetheterms.org. So the overview is we did recommend terms of service and acceptable use policies. Enforcement was something what we wanted to tackle. Right of appeal, transparency, evaluation and training, governance and authority, and state actors, bots, and troll campaigns, which was actually one of the questions that came up in one of the earlier panels. So terms of service and acceptable use policies. Here what we said is that users may not use these services to engage in hateful activities or use these services to facilitate hateful activities engaged in elsewhere, whether online or offline. So we're trying to tackle one of those issues that I think Britton Heller actually brought up in an earlier panel, is how the online hate leads to the offline violence. And we wanted to make sure that we stop the online hate. The terms of the service should also make clear that these are grounds for terminating a user service, so that people are made aware at the very beginning that if they use the platform for this, to incite hateful activities online or offline, that they can be deplatformed. And enforcement, and this is something we were very careful when we talked about enforcement, because there are a lot of companies out there that have great policies. Where they fall short is in enforcing those policies and enforcing them in such a way that I would say is equitable across the platform. And this is something actually that Color of Change did in their research. I believe it was with Black Lives Matter activists. You notice that their content was being taken down at a higher rate than the white nationalists and the white supremacists. So what does that mean? So it's clearly an enforcement problem at that point. So with our model corporate policy, we said that the internet company is going to provide a well-resourced enforcement mechanism that combines technological solutions with staffs responsible for reviewing that content. And the reason for this, and the reason we have this combination, is that we don't think it should be the burden of that community to monitor content on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. That is a heavy burden. And that's something that's actually happening today after the events in New Zealand, where we had some of our allies reach out to us and say, hey, can you please monitor YouTube? Can you please monitor Twitter for us? If you see any of these videos, please flag them immediately. So the burden is falling on them and not the companies to use our technological solutions to get that content taken down or flagged before it spreads widely. The other part about the enforcement is that we want to allow for individuals and organizations, not government actors. So this is going back to the beginning question about who do we trust in moderating content, to flag the hateful activities. And we also want a trusted flagger program. So there are organizations that have been experts in this, and they should have sort of a faster path to get their content that they flag reviewed. And then we also want to inform flaggers of the results, because oftentimes what's been happening is that people flag this content and they don't know what happens. And sometimes multiple people, and there's really no transparency when it comes to that. And the other thing we thought was really important, and this is something that not every platform has, but some are rolling out, is this right of appeal. So if your content gets taken down, you should know why that content was taken down and have a path to appeal it. It seems like a very simple solution. It's surprising that it's taken this long to get some companies on board with this process, but there's a reason for that, and that's because sometimes we are seeing this disparate impact, and we want to have everyone a path to appeal and to not necessarily be deplatformed or have a strike against their account because the historical context or just generally the context of their, of what they've put online isn't being understood. So this is where I'm going to gloss over a little bit of it, but transparency is important. And what the problem is right now is that we actually don't know what's happening on these platforms. We know anecdotally, we know when people tell us what's happening, but overall, because of the scale that Emma mentioned, we really don't know. And I think these companies need to understand that, and they're hiding behind this. So we think that they need to open up when it comes, especially when it comes to hateful activities. How many things are being flagged on the platform as hateful? How many times is a particular post being flagged? Who is doing the flagging? Who is this content targeting? These are questions that I think are really important, and having a report and having this information gives us a better sense of what are the solutions that we can start asking for. So it's one of two, there's more. The other thing is, again, who's doing the flagging and the type of victim that's being targeted. That's another thing we think is important. And what we want with this transparency is the information to be published in a way that can be understood by a regular person, but also machine-readable formats, so it can also be used by scholars. So we want to have that ability. We want to be able to study this information and what's happening on the platforms. And the evaluation and training. This is something actually, again, that Emma brought up, is about Facebook and how the training materials were leaked and how it kind of showed that Facebook didn't quite get it, to say the least. So this has to be part of the corporate policies. They need better training materials, and they need to establish that with a team of experts. And there are experts out there. And those experts should be there training the programmers, as well as the people who are actually enforcing the anti-hate policies. And with that, the internet company should routinely test the technology that's being used to identify hateful activities. They should make those training materials available for the public to review, because we saw how powerful that was when just the Facebook ones were leaked. Like, this is clearly wrong. And then also locate assessment teams enforcing against hateful activities within those impacted communities. And that's, again, a part of the historical context and just understanding that different communities have different needs and really, centering them when it comes to these training materials. And so this is, governance and authority. We were thinking that these companies needed to address hateful activities in the corporate structure as well. So assign a board committee that's responsible for assessing the management and efforts of hateful activities on their services, assign a senior manager, and create a committee outside advisors with expertise in identifying and tracking hateful activities. So this is something, again, structurally within the company that they can do to ensure that they have mechanisms in place to get better at this, because it's not going to be something that happens overnight, but it's something that they can work on. And then through assessment, through evaluation, through transparency, we can get better. And the last thing, this was a question that came up earlier about, whether bots should be considered people. And, I think the way that we're thinking about this is that if a bot is being used to create or administer coordinated campaigns to engage in hateful activities, that should be prohibited from the service. So that's where we stand on that. And that's really the overview of Change the Terms. And I'm just going to kind of go through where we are today. Brandi kind of mentioned it. We launched this on October 25th, 2018 at Center for American Progress. We have been in discussion with internet companies. And one of the things that we're looking forward to later this year is some report cards that are going to assess the company's adoption and implementation of these recommendations, and just see where they are. And we have, as Brandi said, close to 50 organizations that have signed on in support of these recommendations. And I'm just going to put them up there so you guys can see that it is a lot. There is a lot of different groups that support this. Thank you.
So I'll try to keep my remarks fairly brief because I wanted to talk a little bit about what platforms can do, and this will be a lot of what we've already heard from Carmen and Brandi about what's in the Change the Terms documents. I think one way that's really helpful for breaking down the problem of what are the non-legal responses, and in particular what can platforms and content hosts do, is to think about kind of what are the different sorts of motivations for hate speech and hateful activity on platforms, because different motives will lead to different kinds of solutions. So there's people who have a financial motive because they realize that hateful content can get a lot of views and can make them a lot of ad revenue. And we're seeing a lot of platforms starting to look at, different ways of responding to content, not just removing it or deactivating the account, but especially when the adversary has kind of figured out how to really thread the needle of, well, I'm saying something really pretty horrifying, but it doesn't technically violate your terms. We're seeing more companies start to say, okay, fine, but we're not going to run ads against your content, as a way to remove that incentive for putting really polarizing or polemic kind of posts out. Where sometimes the incentive is political. We saw this come up a lot in conversations around disinformation, especially in the U.S. in the 2016 election, where there were all sorts of very clever strategies about using micro-targeting systems in different advertising networks that allow you to get a particular post in front of a very particular audience and make sure that it has exactly the right message to sow division, sow discord. We also saw a lot of what appeared to be Russian political operatives impersonating social justice activists and different kinds of genuine political actors in the U.S. and genuine political views that people held, but using those for for purposes not to, express a genuinely held political view, but to target that content so that it was done in the most divisive way possible. So if we're looking at those sort of motives, that really takes us into the kind of what are the solutions to disinformation sphere, and what do you do when you have, especially a nation-state actor trying to manipulate and abuse a platform for their particular ends. You have things that are like what Tricia on the last panel was talking about, what I think of as the sort of the hate speech and the harassment that comes out of a poorly designed communication experience, right? Whether it's just people being able to post absolutely everything without, that second of, I loved her metric of, would your grandmother be proud of you for posting this? Put it ways to kind of interrupt, potentially hateful or harassing kinds of experiences with just that extra bump or nudge to say, think again or rephrase. So things that really fall in the category of like site design and user experience. And then that there's probably lots of other motives, but it also does leave that category of people who have a bad motive, who have a hateful ideology and they want to express it in a way that hurts other people. And that's where I think, especially the questions about what are the company's content policies, how are they enforcing them, how are they moderating that content, really come into play. Now, one thing I'll say about all of these different approaches is, from my sort of free expression and particularly like First Amendment lawyer perspective, my mind immediately goes to, but what are the unintended consequences, right? What is the way that these same tools or responses or powers will be used for the opposite of the intended aim? And we've seen, and as I think Nadine was talking about earlier this morning, we all are really familiar with the history of whether it's law or policy on a platform being used to silence and censor groups who are already marginalized or already have less of an opportunity to participate in public debate or express themselves. And we've seen those kinds of outcomes come from a lot of the different things that platforms are trying to do, in response to the enormous amount of advocacy pressure the groups like Color of Change and Free Press have been bringing about these issues. There's been a series of stories about sort of the advocacy groups in the US who have sort of been smeared by association with Russian disinformation accounts, who will set up a Russian account sets up a protest or like plans a protest, but then 3 or 4 legitimate advocacy groups also say, yes, we want to protest about this issue. And when the platform takes the response of, shutting down the entire event or deleting all of the accounts and really kind of interrupting groups' ability to connect with their constituencies and build on their networks, that's also not a good outcome. It might be an understandable response if you're looking from how do we stop the spread of, information from this particular source, a Russian disinformation campaign, but the impact and the burden is often felt by people who are, engaged in wholly legitimate activity. It's also a reason why, I have a little bit of concern about the part of Change the Terms that calls for companies other than content hosts to do kind of content moderation, to adopt policies and to actually, not provide domain name services or not provide web hosting services or financial services, because in my work around, especially looking at copyright regulation online, the interest in sort of pushing content regulation deeper into the infrastructure of the internet and moving it away from just the sort of the top level content host into these other infrastructure providers, I have typically seen that used to silence and to censor not the kind of the unlawful activity or the hateful activity that we'd want to be the target, but just as infrastructure companies are not going to spend the time and energy and resources and money to have a well-balanced policy on hate speech that really targets bad actors and doesn't sort of sweep in a lot of other activity. I completely understand having it as a goal, like thinking that they should, and that should be something that they prioritize. I guess I don't have a lot of faith that that's that entities that are in the business of providing kind of more infrastructure sorts of services and not kind of having that direct user interface will prioritize that. But I think all of these concerns about unintended consequences goes exactly to one of Carmen's points about the need for being able to measure and analyze what are the impacts of all of these different systems that platforms are using. How are their content moderation systems working? What are the real consequences? And for all of these different interventions that are starting to be tried, what results are they having? Since the 2016 election in the US, there's been a big focus on disinformation, but pressure from Europe over hate speech and terrorist propaganda has been going for even longer than that, for probably the past 5 or 6 years at a really intense rate. And there have been all of these sort of parallel scientific experiments happening on all these platforms of what if we take down these networks? What if we, change our ad policy this way? And there's not that kind of evaluation that's shared with the public of exactly what are the impacts of any of these. And there's certainly not enough access by independent researchers to test out, if the company says it was very successful, okay, I hope so, but I'd like to verify that through independent research. And we're starting to see a little bit more of that from some companies. I was looking at Facebook's content community guidelines enforcement report, which they just started putting out, again, after years of pressure from advocacy groups about, you need to have more transparency and real data about how these systems work. And they actually have started to try to estimate the prevalence of different kinds of content on their platform. And they have estimates for terrorist propaganda, which they, I think, define in a fairly particular way, or content that includes nudity or sexuality. And with those kinds of material, they provide a prevalence estimate. I think for nudity, it was something like 0.1% of content on Facebook is content that has nudity in it. So it's like a very low percentage, but still something where that means they're taking down millions and millions of posts every quarter that violate their policies. They don't offer an estimate for hate speech, and I think it as I understand how you would measure this sort of thing, I think that makes sense, because the way that they are most likely measuring things like images of nudity or videos or images that are terrorist propaganda are relating to finding matches of images that they've already identified. So terrorist propaganda, finding particular videos, particular memes or images, and then being able to say through a technique called hashing, we found this one instance of the image and we can find every other place it's posted on the site. That gives you a way to actually kind of measure how much of this content's out there. With something like hate speech, I think they are, at this point, being upfront about the fact that they don't know how to measure it, right? There are ways and proxies that you could probably use to get at some of it, but at this point, I think it'd be hard for any platform to claim that they really truly know the extent of hate speech on their platform, and that makes it even harder to start assessing, are they doing anything to meaningfully address it? So I think those are some of the challenges that we'll see going forward in this area, but this, I think, for everybody to keep up this drumbeat of it, we can't just hear kind of assurances from platforms that they are trying to tackle these issues, or that there aren't terrible unintended consequences for the techniques that they are pursuing. We need to see actual verifiable information, because what these different changes and techniques are doing is having a dramatic impact on our information ecosystem. And it's, I think, incumbent on all of us to understand how those dynamics are really playing out.
All right, yeah, I think we've got some time for questions, but if you don't mind, I'm going to use my moderator's wand to ask a few questions first. First of all, I want to say it's really delightful to be on a panel of all women talking about technology, and it's been delightful to see so many women having their voices heard in the room today, so I just wanted to point that out. I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened today. I mean, it's been hard to absorb the news of what happened today in New Zealand as we are kind of absorbing all of this interesting information. It's obviously very related. It's about spreading hate online and the consequences of spreading that hate. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention it. And I think one thing that I wanted to ask about, and I talked with Alex Amond a little bit about this before, is I'd never heard of this concept before, and pardon my language. It's called shit posting. And apparently, I'm not going to read the, quote, great replacement, which is the manifesto that this shooter in New Zealand released before the shooting. But what some authors are stating who are following these things say that this manifesto is a trap itself laid for journalists searching for the meaning behind this horrific crime. There is truth in there and valuable clues to the shooter's radicalization, but it's buried beneath a great deal of, for lack of a better word, shitposting, or basically throwing out huge amounts of content, most of it ironic, low-quality trolling for the purpose of provoking an emotional reaction in less internet-savvy viewers. So my question is, how are we ever going to be able to identify that content if it's constantly changing in a way to deceive people who are looking for that content? That's one question. And the second question is, again, I haven't been able to fully process what's happening, but apparently some of the images and video are still available on Reddit, platforms like Reddit. So just for anyone who would like to respond, this idea of shitposting, how do we manage to monitor that content to look for potentially harmful content? And then how do we keep that content from prohibiting it from being circulated after it's been published?
Did you? Okay. So one, the challenge of identifying shitposting, right, and identifying when somebody is being intentionally ironic or intentionally provocative or both or genuine is. I don't think that's something that a tech platform is going to be able to do from the top down. I think it really points to a shift that I think we should see, I hope we see, towards more of a sort of federation of how content moderation happens on a platform, where you have, there are absolutely things that the whatever platform it is, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, whoever, as the kind of central, the actual host of the content will need to take responsibility for. They will need to respond to orders about unlawful content. They will need to, respond to incitement to violence, to child pornography, to kind of the most intense, the kinds of content where I think everybody would agree their resources should be prioritized. And that's not going to catch everything, either that violates their terms of service or that makes for a bad user experience. But what we've seen in looking at a lot of different kinds of platforms online, that the most functional online communities are ones where you have kind of moderators who are part of the community and who are kind of embedded in the day-to-day interactions. And this is, I think, a really interesting tension to talk about in the sort of, as I think, Carmen, you were saying, the burden that is put on groups when it's saying, like, no, you have to go and find all of the hate speech, you have to find the content that is targeting your community. And I think there's absolutely a key role for the platform to play there, but thinking about finding something as hard to define as shitposting, as, memes that have a sinister undertone, that could be something that a community of users is much better able to identify, to be like, this isn't what this group is about, this isn't what we're for, and to, through different kinds of tools or techniques in doing moderation, remove those kinds of posts or exclude users from certain circumstances. All of this goes back, though, to a lot of questions about how are sites designed, how does the platform imagine content moderation, and I think if the framework is kind of top down, it's going to be one global policy applied to every single potential post out there. It's just not going to work very well.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that I do think that, I don't know, folks, yeah. So I'm going to punt a little bit, but also say that there are definitely groups that are doing work like this. I just, right before this session, was talking to someone from Data and Society who, for us personally, has been like a really invaluable resource for this, like because Color of Change is like a really rapid response organization. We've sometimes got off on stuff where we didn't fully get it right. Like we remember one example, classic example of this is actually after the Parkland shooting, there was immediately a lot of information saying that the shooter was like a white nationalist, and it was like intentional. It was like an intentional campaign. And we like went out on a campaign around, this is why we have to do stuff around white nationalism. Like, oops, our bad. We were wrong this time, but still, we're still right, just not this time. But I think like there are a lot of groups like that. Hope Not Hate is another example that are like kind of doing this work, that are like looking for how things are rapidly changing underground and like really sharing that information. And so I think in addition to like building out these systems and this infrastructure, I think it is really important. This is already happening in Europe, that there is some collaboration with the like sort of research networks that are kind of in those spaces. So I would just add that. There you go.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to answer your question a little bit more directly, you're talking about like, these videos are on Reddit. If we know that, Reddit should know that too, right? So that's why the burden shouldn't just be on us, shouldn't be just on our communities to flag this content, but they should really have like technological solutions that are out there. And Emma mentioned the hashing, right, for terrorist content. Like that is something, why not apply it to these videos? And why not use your algorithm that keeps on feeding people down this like rabbit hole of hateful stuff? Why don't you use that in reverse and find, new content that's being posted on your website, and to take it down before it spreads? Because one of the things that happens is that once it goes viral, it's out there, it's been seen, and it's really hard for people to unsee things.
And just to like double click on that too, on the YouTube, at one point, it was like they were flagging it as sensitive content. So they could find the video and flag it as sensitive, but they couldn't actually remove it. So again, that just reinforces you can find it, but like what steps are you taking to take it down?
All right, well, I'd like to take at this point a moment just to remind everybody that you have a blue or several blue sheets on your table and in your folder as we're kind of wrapping up this discussion. I know one thing that I put on here, what suggestions do you have, is I would have liked a little more time for a Q&A. So I'm going to relinquish my role as the questioner, and we have about 20 plus minutes to really open this up to the audience. So let's have some really kind of final good questions about what we've experienced over the past day and a half. Do we have microphones, Jenny?
Here we go.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. This was a very interesting panel. I would like to just ask a couple questions about the change the terms idea. And what drives my thinking is that I actually think that change the terms is the name for the strategy against what you're doing as much as it is the strategy of what you are doing. We see again and again that all sorts of hateful groups, white supremacists particularly, are very, very good at changing the way they talk about things to avoid content moderation, and Emma alluded to this. And this goes all the way to taking what are mundane ideas like defending Western civilization, which is at least debatably good, or simply true statements like all lives matter, and toxifying them and making them like sort of holders for this sort of hateful attitude. And I recently saw some great research coming out of Princeton showing just the depth to which anti-Semites and white supremacists will go to sort of mask what they're talking about and use complicated numerical patterns and anagrams, just anything to sort of talk within their community without necessarily talking outside of it. And it seems to me that when we start chasing after hateful speech, we end up following it down a rabbit hole. And one interesting example of this that's outside of hateful speech is the way that dissidents work in China, where they will on Chinese social media use near homophones for the words they're using to try to evade government censorship. But the censors, it turns out, like, figure out which homophones they're using, then they ban those, and it really degrades the value of discourse overall because we have to ban more and more and more. And I'm just wondering, is there a good way around this problem? And as a secondary question, is there a historical example of this ever working? being able to accurately police speech in such a way to keep people comfortable without using the real coercive power of the state to punish people, either financially or corporeally, to make them stop. Being banned off of Twitter is really not enough to make people stop.
Do you want to take it, or?
You can.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a historical context, I don't think we've ever seen this, right? And again, what Emma was saying about scale, we've never seen a Facebook that connects people across the world. We've never seen a YouTube. So I think this is a very unique problem that we're dealing with. Also, in terms of kind of what you were saying is like we're playing whack-a-mole a little bit. And I completely understand that. And I think that's why we have to have this this transparency and start really learning what's happening on these platforms, because we are really in the dark. And you know, to that research you were mentioning from Princeton, wouldn't that be great if Facebook started applying that to their platform and learning from that and seeing what their platform is being used for? And I think that's part of change the terms. It's not just literally changing, you know, the terms of service and the corporate policies, but changing the way that we're thinking about this issue and the way that we're talking about it as well.
Yeah. And I would just add on this, I think it's really tempting for us to be sort of chasing after what we think is like the magic wand, that if we wave it magically, like racism will go away, everything will be cool, we'll all love each other, right? And there is no one solution to this. And so for us at Color of Change, and I think for all the groups we work with, like this is one proposal around a set of policy interventions, but it's nothing if not coupled with, we know a disproportionate number of donations to Stormfront come from Palo Alto. And there's a lot of people actually in Silicon Valley that don't just have a white supremacy mindset in a broad frame, but actually identify as white nationalists and make decisions every day around how policies get operationalized. And so there's a lot of work we have to do around changing cultural norms in some of these spaces. Carmen and I both just testified on CDT as well in front of Congress around like policy legislation and a number of interventions. The week before that, I was talking to Facebook shareholders and investors around a number of interventions that we see. One, removing Zuckerberg, for example, as chair from like Facebook. And so there's like a number of different things that I think we have to do here. If we like put all of our chips on this policy and asked Silicon Valley to get this right, frankly, like we would fail. And if we also did this through a strictly American lens, dealing with these like multinational companies and not accounting for what's happening in Brazil and India and all sorts of other places, we would also fail. So it's like one, I would say, of like a menu of tactics that have to be deployed.
Just one point, building on Carmen's point, that this is actually a different information environment that we're looking at. Is the one thing that getting somebody kicked off of Twitter does is deprive them of that audience, right? And that is the kind of the role that a couple of big platforms have for having such a, whether it's sheer number of users, like for a Facebook or a YouTube, or for Twitter, it's special case of like having the attention of all of the media and journalists and a fair number of users, but like having a way outsized role in shaping kind of national discourse, at least at the like frothy surface level. That is something that I think is a really meaningful criteria to think about here. And we've seen parallels to this in the in fights about stopping terrorist propaganda and particularly ISIS networks. And a lot of it was very difficult for social media platforms to identify pro-ISIS propaganda by the content. And what they really started doing was trying to identify networks of accounts that were posting propaganda, amplifying it, recruiting people, and all of that. Now again, I have enormous concerns about the ability for these platforms to exclude certain people from these big public conversations. So I think it's, I'm not saying that this is an absolutely great response and it should be used in all cases, but it is a really meaningful response that they have. It is a particular kind of power. And so when we think about levers that to push to change, how acceptable spewing, racist vitriol is in society, I think we have to take that audience share into account.
Thank you. Let's take another question.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you guys for opening up this awesome discussion. And one of the things throughout the presentation, there's been a lot of talk about tech companies and their responsibility in, regulating social media. But I think another important aspect of it is actually like the social influencers and, the main people on these platforms. So when I do, especially on broadcasting, like YouTube, I know YouTube pretty well. And from what I can identify, what YouTube has a problem with is what's called an adpocalypse, where there are issues on the platform that are identified and actually vocalized by creators. And, YouTube is like hesitant to, respond to that problem. So companies, companies who are advertising on YouTube actually pull their ad revenue and they pull their ads, which not only hurts the company, but it also hurts, the creators who are maybe dependent on YouTube for their living. So, and that creates kind of a strain on the relationship between social influencers and companies. I know one of the most recent things was there was a creator who brought up the fact that on videos, specifically of underage girls doing like gymnastics or something, that in the comments there would be people who would leave timestamps or specific times in the video, which could be viewed as like explicit for pedophiles, which is a huge issue that, YouTube probably couldn't see coming, but at the same time, it's one of those things that you have to take into effect. So my question is, like, what kind of role can companies and influencers have in being more responsive to the issues with digital platforms, and how can that relationship kind of be helped or impacted?
Yeah, I can start. So, I think you just named it. I think it's really important, right, for us to all be working together. I know when I do this, or when Color of Change does this work, we have a kind of power map on the wall that I look at in my office every day that has the universe of people that we're trying to work with or be with. It's Black tech workers, it's and their allies and all of this other stuff. And users is a core part of that. Part of our story of why we're here and why we come to the table and why we talk to these companies is because underneath it all, it is true that technology has in some ways picked up the baton where corporatized media has fallen short. So the more we've seen newspapers or TV shows or things come under the control of very few companies, these platforms have offered a decentralized place for people to be heard. And that's particularly true for Black users, Black organizers. And we actually found a couple years ago, to your point, that we had a bunch of Black YouTube users who found they might be beauty bloggers or doing something else, but if they talked about a police killing that happened, then YouTube would demonetize their video. So they were dealing with all of these sort of issues, and we found them to be a really powerful organizing constituency, one, to talk to the companies, but also to be able to use their voice in a number of ways to highlight what was happening on the platform. So I think those partnerships have to exist, and yeah, I think the idea that you put forward is already a good one.
So I agree with Brandy that those partnerships need to exist, and I think what, in your question, you kind of pointed the power that the advertisers have, right? And how the companies and the platforms will react to those advertisers, and in certain instances they overcorrect, right? So they do what the advertisers want, but it ends up hurting those small creators. And I think having those conversations and building those relationships is something that these companies do need to do better.
And I'll just kind of flag another similar avenue for trying to influence companies having to do with finances, and that's investors or people who are shareholders for publicly traded companies. And I know that's something that a number of orgs are looking at, of actually lobbying shareholders to say, to hold the companies in which they've invested to particular standards, and to say that we, as the one entity you have a legal fiduciary duty to, that you are obligated to do stuff that's in the shareholders' best interest, we want you to tackle hate speech on your platform, tackle harassment on your platform, have a better response to what are you going to do about, terrorist propaganda videos. So that's, I think, another potential angle that is exactly in that frame you're looking at of like what are all of the dynamics for trying to influence these companies.
Another question.
Thank you very much. One of the things I'm curious about when we're talking about regulation, whether it's by the board within Facebook or government, things like that, is kind of the idea of requirement of use. So I'm totally cool with a ton of regulation on highways, food, those kind of things. I'm required by my job to have email and to have a cell phone in terms of a phone number. Any of the rest of these kind of things, I opt whether or not I ever enter the scheme or ever enter the world whatsoever. And from my perspective, that ends up meaning that it should be less regulated than perhaps something I'm required to use. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts in terms of the impact of volunteer entry into these worlds.
Well, in terms of regulation, and I want to make this clear with change the terms, we're not asking for the government to regulate speech. So we think that these companies, created this problem as kind of, it was like a collateral damage, right? Like they wanted to build up their platforms, make more money, and so that's why we are asking them to be part of the solution. And I agree, there is a level of, you can choose whether or not to be on Facebook. Now, there's a lot of people that is not necessarily, like they don't feel like they have that choice, right? Especially if they want to connect with family. I have family in Puerto Rico. Like if I'm not on Facebook, it would be very difficult for me to have daily conversations with them, post pictures of the kids, so it's almost like I've tried to disentangle myself from Facebook, but I can't. Right? Like it's become a part of my life. It's where I posted pictures of my wedding, of my kids being born. And I just, I feel like that's what happens with a lot of these people that, we're on this platform. There is a lot of good there. And so we want to make sure that it is a safe place for people to continue to be on.
And I think particularly for, a company like a Facebook or talking about wanting a safe environment for its users, or Twitter wanting healthy conversations. I forget exactly how YouTube frames it, but, they want you to have a good time on YouTube. Yeah. When a company puts itself out there, it's like, this is what we are trying to offer, then, that begins the conversation on like, okay, but here are the ways that we, your users, find that you're not meeting those standards that you yourself have articulated you're trying to meet. I think there's certainly sites out there that don't purport to offer a safe or even enjoyable experience, and so maybe the argument to try to get them to change their ways has less clout. But in that kind of the contract with the user, and then I think it also, especially as we think of these as global platforms, building on what Carmen said, there's a couple of different studies that show that like in different countries in Southeast Asia, more people will report using Facebook than will report having access to the internet, because the adoption of using digital platforms has been so synonymous with the adoption of smartphones, and there wasn't the sort of 10, 15-year run-up of dial-up internet connection that we experienced here in the US. It was sort of, oh, hey, you've got this device in your hand, you can do so much through this Facebook icon, and then, yeah, the internet's a thing, right? And so, especially when you're thinking in situations like that where people have, really relied on particular platforms to do pretty much all of the telecommunications capability that they have, then I feel like it starts shifting back more towards that sense of like, I can't do my job without email kind of perspective.
Yeah, I would also just double down on, I think right now where we are is the ability to opt out is a little bit of an illusion. My dad has never had a Facebook account, is super suspicious of the internet, like has a phone that's like the size of a brick, but he has a footprint on Facebook, actually has a profile on Facebook, and it's because my mom happens to be like way more tech savvy than I am actually, or the people in his life have like, information up. They're still like tracking you. They're still tracking your data. Facebook is building curriculum in schools. So for kids from an early age, their first encounter with the internet or with anything can come through like Facebook. To this point, I think of this like infamous story that I talk about a lot where journalists in the Philippines were talking to Mark Zuckerberg around the issue of like disinformation, misinformation, and they were like, it's really important that Facebook step up because like 97% of people in the Philippines use Facebook. And he was like, my question is, what are the other 3% doing? Which, you know, says a lot. But again, like their model is growth. There's more adherence to it. There's more like people on Facebook than identify as Christians in the world right now. So, and everywhere you go, just to have entrance into our economy, you have to do it digitally. Like you can't apply for a job at the gas station without doing it online. So in many ways, that question of whether we can opt out, at least at this point, and when you add in like monopoly power and how that's playing out, so even if you go on WhatsApp, because that's a free way to connect to people, now WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, and now they're getting ready to pump ads onto WhatsApp. So there's a lot of work that has to be done on a number of fronts in order to create that, to make the opt-out culture an actual reality, I'd say.
Okay, let's take another question.
Yeah, this is kind of related to this previous question, and not just in this panel, but in most of the panels where technology and how to handle this on technology came up. A lot of the focus, and I'd say all three of you also hinted at this not being the focus in different ways, but a lot of the focus has been on the companies and what to do about the companies. And I'm a social psychologist, and I see, yes, I agree, this is a new moment or unique moment where we have all this interconnectivity, but then so some of it to me seems like, well, a lot of this is on the users, and these are human behaviors that are happening because we're so interconnected now. And so as another aside, there's a report from the ADL that came out late last week in conjunction with the Network Contagion Research Institute, basically demonstrating that when Twitter bans people, Gab gets a boost. So they're not losing their platform, they're going to a more homogenous platform where social psychological research would suggest they're now going to get more extreme because they're in an echo chamber. So, like I said, so I think all three of you kind of have addressed and said it's not, we can't just expect the companies to do this. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about your ideas for perhaps influencing the users a little bit and making it more of like a bottom-up thing where we change these interactions that way.
So I don't know if this will directly answer your question, but I think Britton actually brought this up earlier, and she was talking about design choices that the companies make and how that influences the users. And I think that's a huge part of it, and that's why we have focused so much on the companies, because they have that ability to manipulate your behavior. And that's something that I know Facebook has done, and they've done some studies into that to figure out whether you're happy, whether you like Facebook, whether you're a little bit sad, and they can manipulate your feed, in any number of ways to do that research. And something that's someone actually pointed out to me is that every 5th post on your Facebook is an ad. And I was like, really, is that true? And I sat there and I went through, I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Or it's someone sharing an ad, and it's really interesting that there are these design choices that are being made that are influencing people, and I believe Britton mentioned that, like, seeing people's eyes changes the way that people react. So I think there needs to be that level of design choice, and they're designing these products in a specific way to get a specific response and to maximize their revenue right now.
Yeah, I think part of it is about, what are the tools that a platform makes available to its users, and how they can use those to better shape their experience. I mean, it's the promise of the internet is that it is this, potentially radically decentralized network where anybody can attach to the end of it and create their own website, create their own app, like really shape whatever experience they want to have. But of course, that's not how most people are using the internet today. And so I think we are in this interesting tension between, for my part, I really see the kind of the strongest path forward for people is reclaiming that ability to craft and make spaces that really do what you want them to do, because it's really, really hard to get companies to change and start doing not what they want to do for, business motive, but what you want them to do for, a good social purpose. But it's also really hard. There's a fairly high, it's low burden or low barriers to entry as far as creating a new site because there's no regulator you have to go through, there's no broadcaster you have to get to agree to carry your speech, but there's still barriers, right? It's not easy for everybody to go and make a, now I'm going to start sounding like a Squarespace ad, like, make their own website and make it, work on mobile and all that. And there's also this question of will anybody else be there? Will you be talking to people? So as we're still, I think, always going to be tied to what are the platforms or services that enable us easily to interconnect with other people, and that's where questions about design choices, and there's a lot of different research going into like what makes for functional communities. There's really interesting studies on Reddit, which showed that for subreddits, for particular threads or forums on the site, that clearly signposted their basic rules for that thread at the top of the thread. It was just like sticky up there, so every time you went to it, you were just reminded like, oh, don't be a jerk, and like this is the topic of the site, and here's how we're going to apply things. It decreases negative interactions, decreases the number of posts that have to be removed for violating rules, and also I think like drew out more new speakers, and it helped when people had that, it seemed to be that when people had that signal of this is what is, these are the rules of the road, this is acceptable behavior, it gave some lurkers the confidence to be like, oh, I can speak up here, I can make my voice heard, and maybe I have that confidence that I'll be treated well when I do. So I think there's a lot in that sphere, but it requires, I'm not sure, other than maybe in Facebook groups, how you could do that sort of thing in a Facebook experience. Really not clear how you would sort of translate that into a Twitter experience. So I think it also depends on kind of fundamental site architecture. But.
All right, I think Dr. Jenny Lamb has asked me to close things. So first of all, I'd like to thank Jenny for putting this together. This was a lot of work. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank all our panelists and speakers today. Everyone did such a great job. It was fascinating. Thank you. This is just basically several rounds of applause here. All the high school students and teachers that were here today, thank you so much for being here. So what I'd like to ask is that the speakers who have PowerPoint presentations, maybe pass them along to Jenny. We can post them on the website. That's slpl2019.org. Let's keep the conversation going. We have a reception out in the atrium, co-sponsored by Heterodox Academy. So on that note, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to talking with you more. Thank you.